So, one question that I've been asked before on other podcasts is this: if I could go back in time and give my first year head coach self any advice, what would it be? Now, this is a tough question to answer because there is a lot that I would want to tell my younger self. I could spend days giving my younger self advice. However, I have spent the last few months really reflecting this question of, what do I know now that I wish I knew as a first year head coach? And, honestly, what do new head coaches, even new head coaches in today's environment, what do they need to know? Like, what's essential? Now, as I've been answering this question, I've had one major constraint. I've had to answer this question in under 60 minutes. And the reason for this constraint is that over the last year, I've been challenged by some club directors, athletic directors, and even recently some state athletic associations to produce a new online course for coaches, particularly new coaches, though I think this applies to everyone, but to produce this new online course that is even shorter, more foundational than the 3-hour level 1 TOC transformational coaching and culture certification course that we offer. So, as I've been busy in the writing and production of this new course, I thought, heck, I'm going to reach out to my friends and co-hosts, Betsy, Butterick, and Nate Sanderson, for their perspective on a few of the topics that I know would be really important to cover in this course. And I also decided to record this conversation and share it with you all here on the Coaching Culture Podcast. So, welcome back to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. My name's JP Nerbun, and I'm joined by the team, Nate and Betsy, for a roundtable discussion on some important topics that coaches inevitably face each season. Now, this episode today is going to cover playing time, team conflict, and sports parents. In part 2, our next episode of the podcast, we're going to discuss referees, social media, and personal habits and self-care. If you want to get the notes to this and every episode of the Coaching Culture Podcast, head on over to tocculture.com. There you can subscribe to our newsletter and check out our online courses, including our latest course, the Foundations Coaching course, and the Working with Sports Parents online course. Also, if you want to learn more about Betsy Butterick, subscribe to her blog and check out her social media, head on over to betsybutterick.com. All right, enough about all that. Here's part 1 of our conversation on advice for new coaches. So let's kick it off here with our first topic around playing time. So if you could give one piece of advice to a new head coach on playing time, what would that be, Betsy?
The piece of advice I would give is to have the conversation early, and many coaches do, of like, hey, not everyone's going to get the same number of minutes, or ideally the minutes that they want. It's one thing to tell them, and it's another to show them. So an activity that I like to do is I'll give a piece of scrap paper to everybody on the team, and I'll say, you don't need to put your name on this, but I want you to write down ideally the number of minutes you'd like to play in a single game. And depending on your sport, you might need to adjust the metrics a little bit. And then I say, be realistic, think about your skill set in the context of your teammates. But with a realistic number, how many minutes would you ideally like to play in a single game? So they write those down and we collect them. And then I'll have the last person who has the pile read them off. And then we'll add on a calculator as they continue to read. And then I'll put that number up on the board. And then I'll multiply it by the number of games in their season. And then we get this gigantic number of minutes that people want to play. And then what we do is we put the number of minutes available in any particular game by the numbers in the season. We compare the two. However you do the math, the number of minutes people want to play for any team is astronomically higher than the number of available minutes. And so that sets the stage for, okay, now we know that how many minutes people want to play is far over the available minutes. The pivot then becomes, what do we want to do in the time that we're not playing? And so what I'll do immediately after showing them those numbers is saying, okay, we have a choice to make, and I'll draw a line in the middle of the whiteboard. And then above the line, I'll put a plus sign. Below the line, I'll put a negative. And then the question for the group is, what can anybody choose to do that adds value to the team experience separate from playing time? And then we start to list behaviors that people can choose, especially when they're not playing. And then I'll ask the same question below the line. What are choices that people make, behaviors that negatively impact the experience that we can have together? And so for me, I like to illustrate playing time in a visual way, and then also talk about, okay, in the time we're not playing, what choices do we want to be intentional about to make sure that collaboratively we are having the kind of experience that we want to have?
I think that's great, Betsy. When I think, JP, about things I wish I knew when I first started coaching about playing time, the three questions I think were most important that I never took the time to answer would be, number one, just what do I want? Whether that's positionally or schematically or philosophically, I think just being able to articulate, we're going to play hard, or we're going to play fast, or we're going to play free, or we're going to shoot a lot of threes, or whatever that system and style and philosophy is going to be. I didn't really have the ability to articulate that probably until 10 years into my career, because I just never really spent time thinking about it. And I think that kind of leads to the second thing, when you start to have either the individual job descriptions based on positions. Here's what's expected in this role, this spot, et cetera, is how do you measure it? What are the behaviors, and how are you measuring what's productive or what's effective? Because obviously we're not always going to go by analytics in basketball. Obviously, it tends to lend itself to the use of statistics. They inform our decisions, but they also help us to check our work when it comes to what we think we're seeing. And so when we can communicate with players and say, here are the things that we're looking for, you got to be able to convert at the 3-point line. Here's what you're doing in practice, and here's what you're doing in games, and here's that in context with your teammates. All of a sudden, I think it just helps us to get to that third piece, which is, how do we communicate about playing time, specifically with individuals and with the team? I think it's a conversation that I was afraid of probably for the first, I don't know, 10, 15 years of my career, because it leads to conflict with players. It leads to disagreement with parents. It can lead to meetings and administrators sending the emails. But if you neglect it, like, you're going to pay for it on the other end. And so, as Betsy said, whatever you can do on the front end to front load it, I think activities like that are great to provide perspective, but also just understanding, so your players understand, how do I ask questions about playing time? When are we doing check-ins? If there's going to be a move made in the lineup, what's that going to be like? And just being able to think through those situations before they happen, I think gives you a better chance to be successful and productive when it comes to trying to deal with what is probably the most difficult issue for new coaches or any coaches, and that's the playing time issue.
Yeah, I love what both you shared there. I think Betsy and a lot of coaches have probably done that activity initially, like the counting up the minutes. But what you shared there on the questions of getting them to really kind of co-create standards of how do we handle ourselves when we don't get the minutes, we're not playing, but also how do we add value, right? And it's also reinforcing that we can add value to the team and the team experience. So I love that. What I've seen in the playing time issue, the biggest triggers consistently at almost every level is they come down to expectations and perceptions. Players have certain expectations of certain minutes. Like, you can still go and do the standard around, like, how do we handle, like, when we, don't get to play as much as we want, or you can count up, do the minute counting activity. And then there's still players still going, yeah, I get that, but I still should be playing a lot more, right, than everybody else. They're all delusional. I'm not, right? So it's grounding expectations and there's perceptions. And I think just when we're generally speaking around sports, right? Obviously, a lot of our coaches are competitive level sports here, at the collegiate and the high school levels around that demographic. But there's really, how do you determine playing time? Nate, you just spoke to that. I think there's some recreational coaches out there, some development coaches, there's JV coaches, so there's a wide range. There's three types of ways that you would determine playing time. One is in a competitive environment, which is probably a large portion of our listeners here today. There's also the recreational environment, which is about everybody getting a chance to play. And you might have hey, we're going to have equal playing time, right? That's my current experience coaching my daughter's team. There's also developmental, teams, it's the JV or feeder programs. You're giving everyone an opportunity to play, so everyone gets an chance to develop. Now, not every team's within that, and I think even competitive teams might have development minutes. Like, hey, we're ahead by 20, we're down by 20, whatever. So we're trying to give everyone opportunities to develop. So no team is in one bucket or the other, but it's really important to communicate whatever team you coach at, how you determine playing time. So some of the stuff that Nate, you just shared there is really important, but also for all our coaches and all listeners, they're just like, hey, we are a recreational team. We will have equal playing time. Or we're a development team, which means everyone's going to get at least 25% of the game to play in. Or we're a competitive team, which means we're going to play players that give us the best chance of winning. So just grounding expectations can be really, really important. And then to your point also, like, how do I communicate? Nate, you talked about how do we communicate the playing time and how much players going to play. So often, the perception, the story that they tell themselves isn't actually true. It's coach pulled me because I made a mistake. It's coach doesn't like me. Those types of things. And that becomes a real trigger even within the game for athletes. And so often we as coaches, we make decisions. Players don't understand why we made those decisions. And we say, well, they just have to trust us. They just have to trust. And there comes to a point where that is the case, but to go an entire year without explaining why you continuously pull them out at this point in the game or this quarter, you're just creating a lot of challenges and obstacles, especially for this generation that wants to know why so often, for them to be able to buy into and trust your decisions. So if you sub a player out, but you don't put them back in the game because another player comes on and actually plays really, really well, and it's not necessarily something they did wrong, like just letting them know that, like, hey, you came out because of this. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just player A just came in there and played so well today. So that's why she stayed in the game. So just communicating your why behind decisions can help players to at least buy in or accept those decisions. So just the more we can take that time to communicate our why behind decisions, the better.
One of the big challenges for athletes, I find, is answering that why question for parents, for peers, for people in their support system that are saying, why aren't you playing? And sometimes that's a really challenging question for a young athlete, especially to say, well, I'm just not quite as good yet as, my teammate. So even from a coaching context, thinking about if a player on my roster was asked that question, let's say by a peer or a parent, what would their answer likely be? And then controlling our controllables, making sure, like you mentioned, JP, having that conversation of, hey, you came out because it was, I needed to give you a break. And then the person that went in played exceptionally well. I need to leave them on the court. I just want to let you know you didn't do anything wrong. This was a circumstantial thing. So if we as coaches can think about what answer can I give them that prepares them to better answer that question so that they don't fill in the blank with, I don't know, or coach doesn't like me, or whatever it happens to be. Because that's a really hard question for many people to ask. So proactively, we can think as coaches, what would I like their answer to be? And then how do I want to communicate in advance of them being asked that question?
Yeah, I love that aspect of giving them the ability to articulate that to others as well. So our next challenge for new coaches is team conflict, and how we handle that. How do we respond to that? How do we normalize that? How do we grow through that? Betsy, I'll let you take off there.
Yeah, this one, if you've been a coach for any amount of time or a human, I'll say for any amount of time, you're aware that conflict is unavoidable. And I would even layer into that conflict can be a really positive thing. Typically, when there is some sort of conflict, it's often around topics or conversations that truly matter. And when people have differing opinions and are open to having conversations, we often learn things that allow us to be better people, better teammates, and to achieve greater success. So conflict can be a really healthy thing. And because most of us have had a few things be true at some point in our life, number one, most of us were not taught how to engage in conflict and do it well. Number two, many of us have found ourselves in conflict situations that cause some level of trauma, where we have no desire or a very low desire to revisit those types of conversations. So even looking at those two elements, it benefits us as coaches, as educators, to help young people start to practice what conflict conversations look like. Knowing that these things are going to arise, even though we may not know what or when specifically, most of us have enough experience to be able to pull, okay, maybe not on this team, but on other teams that you've been on, what sorts of conflicts have come up? Or what sorts of challenging conversations have you found yourself needing to have? And then sourcing from your team possible scenarios, and then allocating practice time, just as you would for any other skill, to start to practice having these conversations. And to have them do, let's say, 2-minute skits. They're given a communication challenge, and then they have to model within a small group how they would actually go about having that conversation. And when I do this with teams, I also add, hey, make it real. Like, because often what you get back is the sort of best case scenario conversation of how this conflict will be resolved. So I say to people, if you think you're going to bring this up to someone and they're not going to respond well, show us that. Like, show us how you would navigate that moment in the confrontation. So just being intentional about practice, because we are much more likely to be successful in conflict, I'll say contexts or conversations, if we've already had the opportunity without the pressure of it being the real thing to start to practice some of the skills that lend themselves to these conversations going well and to these moments of conflict building relationship and trust instead of deteriorating those things.
I think that's great, JP and Betsy. I'm going to take it from the other end of the spectrum here. I think the hardest conflicts that we've ever had to deal with, really, in my career, it seems like snuck up on us, and then all of a sudden, there's an explosion here, and you're trying to figure out what the hell's going on while you're dealing with people that are angry and upset and frustrated and lashing out and whatever that conflict may look like. And so we've really invested a lot of our time and energy in really developing a surveillance system, I think is probably the best way to say it, where as a coaching staff, we have ways to become more aware of things that are festering before they explode. And so, we talk all the time about, doing the consistent one-on-one meetings with players and check-ins throughout the year and trying to do our best to create a place of psychological safety where they do feel comfortable saying, Betsy's been frustrating me at practice, or JP won't get off my case, or coach keeps yelling at me for this, or whatever it might be, where we can deal with those things early rather than react to them late. And so that's been a major focus for our program here at Mount Vernon over the last 3 years. I think the Captain's Council is another way where our team now, if you interviewed our players, would say that they have a confidence that if there's something in the locker room or something that's a concern for them, that it will get to the coaching staff and it will be handled with the captains. And so even just that, talking about an apparatus where things will be addressed and they will be given attention at the appropriate time, and players feeling confident in the outcomes that they've experienced, at least so far as we've, handled things in that way, I think has helped a lot. And if I think back again to my first year in coaching, didn't have a captain's council, didn't, check in with players at all, never talked about playing time, tried to sweep player to player conflict under the rug and hope we can get through the season. And then kids get mad at each other and, don't take your classes and they don't go out for the sport again. Right. So probably not the best way to get started there, but I think that surveillance system can be very helpful for coaches as well.
Yeah, there's so much I want to tell my younger self on this one about, and so many moments where I screwed this up. I mean, even just talking about sweeping it on the rug, I think even just, I was just reflecting on a practice I was coaching last week. And, there was a moment of conflict where two girls really got chippy and upset. And I kind of like, oh, let's just kind of brush it aside. Right. And did I need to stop the whole practice with all 30 girls and like deal with it there? It could have been a great opportunity, but once I'm really emotionally triggered young girls there, it was probably best for me to, hey, let's pull off the side and deal with this after practice, or deal with it in the moment and then come back and share with the group. Like there's moments in these conflict, but it's either, so often it's like, we got to get on with the practice. We got to get on with the training session, or we just need to get to the end of the year. We got 1 month here. Let's just ride it out. Right. And so often we don't make that investment of time and emotional energy to manage and deal with that conflict. My encouragement for young coaches here in these moments is, it's really important how we show up and how we model handling that conflict. And it's, the great thing is when we talk about training this as adults, like I'll have many opportunities when my kids come home tonight to train how to deal with conflict, right? As brother and sister fight each other. And for me, I always try to go off of these 3 steps. One is just to be curious to people's truths, right? Everyone has their own truth, right? So what is my daughter's truth in this conflict? What is my son's conflict? What's my truth in that? Right. But just really coming in and asking questions. So if it's a parent conflict around playing time, or an athlete or 2 athletes fighting, or it's you and your staff, right? Like, adults have a lot of conflict, right? That oftentimes becomes a big issue within teams as well. But sitting down and listening and trying to understand what is their truth. Second step is then to share your assessments and your assertions. Your assertions are the facts. Your assessments are your judgments and opinions, and to separate those two things. The facts are player A said this, player B said this in that moment. We know those to be true, right? Our assessments are, this player's being selfish, this player's right. So, but just separating and sharing those in that way of like, hey, I observed this. These are the facts. I think, or it seems like this is what's going on. So being able to separate those becomes a lot less triggering when we're sharing our perspective. Okay. The last step I always encourage is some sort of collaboration. We are not the sole, really responsible for all conflicts that happen within our team. There's a lot of people at play in that. So bringing them to the table and saying, hey, what can we do to solve this? Because I understand that you feel this way and you might feel this way and I feel this way here, but we can't continue with the way that things are currently. So what can we do moving forward? What's the solution to this conflict? So bringing people in there so they have some ownership responsibility, I think is a big component of it. So now you can't talk about conflict in sports without talking about sports parents. So sports parents, right? Once again, another area that I screwed up massively here as a young coach. Give young JP some advice, Betsy. What do you got for us?
Well, I'm first going to give young JP or current JP some love on behalf of young JP, because I know your newest book, The Sports Parent Solution, is largely based off of your intentional learning about how to be better with parents and then how to teach others to do so. So thank you for putting that out into the world. Whether you're a first-time coach or a current coach who's been doing it for a while, the best advice I can offer is if you are not currently proactively partnering with your parents, please put that high on your to-do list. We are fully in the space where it benefits not only us as coaches, but our athletes as well, to work collaboratively with their parents to create an optimal sport environment. For me, what that looks like if I'm advising a coach is to first self-reflect on where are your current pain points or most frequent challenges when it comes to the relationship with sports parents. Identify those and then ask yourself the question, what needs to be true? So, what needs to be true in order for me to show up as my best self, to give my best to the athletes in my program? And within those pain point or challenge areas, what needs to be true in order for these to be minimized or ideally be resolved? And then from there, that becomes the basis of having a conversation around setting expectations with your parents. We have the opportunity as coaches, especially at the start of our season, to teach our parents how to work really well with us in support of their child. The way that we do that is completely up to us. And anytime I talk about expectation setting, I would advise that that be a two-way conversation. Often I see coaches, even if it's just with athletes, not with parents, say, this is what I expect of you as a coach, and this is what you can expect of me as an athlete. And that's it. So if we're working with parents saying, this is what we expect of your athletes, this is what they can expect of us, this is what we expect of you as parents, and this is what you can expect of us. And what haven't I talked about that you feel is important to understand or address? Or have I missed anything here that for you as a parent has come up on past teams or in past programs that you want to bring into the conversation? Giving them that opportunity, and if you've really done a great thorough job on the forefront, there might not be much for them to add, but simply that invitation is the first olive branch of sorts of like, hey, it's my team, it's your athlete, you're their parents, and we are going to coexist in this shared space, and here's how we can do it really well. So setting expectations across all the different categories, whether it's playing time or attendance or anything that your parents are going to be involved in, and then finding ways to allow them to, I'll say, showcase their unique skills and abilities. So whether you create, a parent committee that's in charge of X, Y, and Z, like finding ways to involve them separate from them trying to find ways to be proactive in their child's sport experience, which I know sometimes for coaches feels less proactive and more like a nuisance or a hassle. So just thinking through, what needs to be true in order for the parents of this program to operate in a way that allows me to be my best as a coach while also minimizes challenges that maybe we've had in the past and allows their athlete to have a high quality experience as well.
Yeah, JP, I think I would echo a lot of that, and I would just start with just get the book. Like that's the best resource that there is out there to walk you through the best way to, I think, interact and embrace the opportunities that there are with parents to be involved in your program in a positive way. I'm probably just putting a little bit different spin on a lot of the things that Betsy shared here, but I think the phrase that really helped me the most in my career here is just thinking about the role of a parent. We've gotten better about role definition with our players, what's expected of our point guard, what's expected of our teammates, what's expected in these situations, and having those conversations. And it wasn't until, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago where I really started to thinking about what's the role of the sports parent in our program. And so in our parent meetings, we've had conversations that are both a facilitation where we're asking questions and allowing them to have discussion in small groups with coaches and players and parents all mixed together about how our values translate into the role of a parent. So when we talk about gratitude, effort, and love, like there's a manifestation of those values in behaviors by the coaches, by the players, and also by the parents, but they're different, right? So when parents are going to give effort, they're not going to dive on the floor for a loose ball, but they might bring orange slices for the team after the game. So even just thinking through, like, we want everybody to be a reflection of the things that we value here. What does that look like for a parent? And opening up some conversation about that, I think, has been really valuable for us. And then the other thing that's really been a game changer for us, and it piggybacks off of what we've already talked a little bit about here in terms of just our communication systems, is what do we expect players to be able to communicate? And we've created this system, right, where they are empowered, hopefully, and enabled to be able to have an ongoing conversation with the coaches throughout the season where they can ask questions about playing time. The players can do this. They can advocate for themselves. We create a system for that, and we create an expectation for that. And we ask permission from the parents to be able to allow the player to grow in that area. And as we talked about before, look, adults are terrible with conflict and asking for feedback, and certainly players are no better, right, at 14, 15, 16 years old. So this is a place for them to be able to grow, just like when we go to practice and they haven't used their left hand very much. That's a place for them to grow. And I use this analogy, and I'm sure I've shared it on the podcast before, but when parents jump in and want to have a meeting to figure out what their player needs to do better to get more playing time, they're robbing the player of the opportunity to grow in that and mature in that ability in that conversation. They would never say, look, Betsy, my daughter Betsy doesn't know how to use her left hand for layups, and I heard that you're asking her to do that in practice. So I'm going to come in and do that for her so she can watch until she really feels comfortable doing it herself. Like, nobody would, say that, right? That doesn't make any sense. But in a lot of ways, we have to frame that for parents to understand that we're creating an opportunity for them to grow. And on the flip side of that, and JP, you really helped me with this, is that there are times where we do want parents to reach out. And so we want to be clear about what those times are as well. If a player's frustrated, if something's going on in the family, like if there are things we say that will affect my ability to coach the player, that it would be useful for me to know, please reach out. And I give them a couple of examples of productive ways that that's been done in the past. But again, a lot of it, so many of these things, right, come back to communication, and just the transparency factor with parents, I think, matters a lot. And it takes a lot of time and effort to think through, as Betsy said, what are the expectations that we have? What are the systems of communication? And then, as we've mentioned over and over, being as consistent as we can will mitigate or minimize the number of problems and conflicts that you'll have with parents throughout the season.
Well, I appreciate both of your endorsements of my book. Very good. Great. You guys are very good friends. So thank you for that. Obviously the book has so many strategies that everyone can have access to those strategies right away and you can go implement them. If I was honest with my daughter's team, 8, 9-year-olds, my son's team, like I'm implementing 10% of them, 15% of them. What I am, so it's less about the strategies, I think, is the biggest barrier here, right? There's plenty of strategies that coaches can do to engage parents and to be more proactive. What I think most coaches are lacking is the mindset. I talk a little bit about that about the book, but this is huge. So when I think about I was actually interviewed on another podcast around the book, and the host of this podcast, I won't say his name, was like, "Hey, I get it. All these things sound like great, but like, end of the day, parents should just be grateful that I'm coaching their kid, and they should just be shut up." Essentially, is what he said. And I said, "Well, if you have that type of mindset, then you will continue to experience the same problems as you're experiencing. At the end of the day, I'm going to finish work here at 5 o'clock. I'm going to run and collect my 3 kids. I'm going to come home, try to feed them. Then I'm going to go to my son's practice and I'm going to coach with 2 of the other kids staying on the sideline because my wife has to work like in the city. And I could easily show up with I've got to do this. And everyone should just be grateful for all the sacrifices that I do to be able to coach, the practice planning at 5 a.m. this morning to put together a bit of a session plan, right? I could have that type of mindset. It's very easy for me to fall into that if I was honest. And I think it's easy for any coach, right? All the things that we do and sacrifices we make for our players. Except I really try to take the time to always make sure that my heart posture is right when I interact with parents, which is I'm actually recognizing that first off, they're doing this, they are making the same sacrifices to get their kid there. They're going through incredible lengths to help support them to be in that sporting experience. They're trusting me to have an impact on their kids' lives. And so when I had a mother come up to me and say, "Hey, thanks so much, JP, for coaching." I said, "Thank you. Thank you for bringing your daughter here." I said, "This is one of the best parts of my day. I love doing this. I'm so lucky," right? They're trusting me. I don't know anything about this sport here in Ireland. I'm coaching, and they still trust me to get out there and coach their daughters. It's just an absolute privilege. So having a real, true, authentic mindset of gratitude. Secondly, I would say is the mindset of taking the initiative to affirm parents. Nothing felt better than when my wife and I sat down and read our daughter's report card last night, and we learned about what a great classmate she was, how she was a great caring friend, and how she was intrinsically motivated in school. Like hearing all these things goes, yes, we're doing things right, right? And so often as parents, many of us on this podcast are listening, 3 of us here, like we're deeply insecure. Are we doing a good job? Like it's parenting is scary. And so the more that we can take time, and so this is another thing I really try to do, which is just if I see a parent share, what do I enjoy and what do I love about coaching their daughter or their son? Like, what do I appreciate? And so just to affirm them in that, it feels really good for the parents, right? And what's going to end up happening is you're going to say to the parent, and they're going to go back and say, "Well, you won't believe what coach told me about you today. How much he loves this," right? Or how much he really enjoys this. And that, not that it's the intention, but it's going to build trust and respect. And the athlete's going to be like, "Oh, coach believes in me." The last thing I'd say is to share concerns. There was something in my son's report card that we were not aware of, right? And with some of his reading challenges and things like that, and how he rushes through his homework. I was like, man, this would have been really good to know a few months ago, right? So we could have talked with him and worked with him on it. And so the more that we as a coach can say, "Hey, I'm noticing, your son, your daughter, they're struggling with this," really encourage them if they're out and back, to work on these skills. Or, "Hey, we're noticing these types of behaviors. We're working with them on it, but, encourage them in this," right? So the more that we can share what we're observing and our concerns, especially before it becomes an issue, before it becomes that behavioral issue that actually now they're benched because of it, or that behavioral issue that now you're like, yeah, they actually might get cut from the team. Like the more that we can get out front and share those concerns, I think the more that parents are going to be less on the defensive, and they're going to be more like, okay, how can we actually work together to help them through that? So for me, it's all about mindset, gratitude, affirming, sharing concerns here. Like to Betsy's point, it's about partnering together. We're working with them to help develop these kids. Okay, so we're going to take a break in our conversation, and we'll be back for more next episode discussing referees, social media, and personal habits and self-care. As you probably already realized, much of this advice that we're giving is good advice for all of us to follow. It's some great reminders for all coaches, including myself, even as I coach my daughter's under-9s football team. I actually love sharing these ideas, putting them out there, because it really holds me accountable to make sure that I'm living these things out. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Coaching Culture Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a review, and share this episode with some coaches out there. Maybe it's some new coaches, or maybe it's some coaches that have been in it for a while that might find some value in this episode.